The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling.
Top of the day. My name's Joe Doolittle.
And I'm Kate Dudding.
And this is
Story by Story, sharing the human experience.
Mm-hmm. And we're here to bring you an hour of conversation and maybe a little shared learning on topics in storytelling, which is the oldest art form in our culture. Matter of fact, stories were told before there was culture, I think.
Well, certainly before they started drawing in those caves in France.
That's right, because they had to learn how to draw. But once they...
Right. Music, you know, I've heard musicians want to arm wrestle, but we're close, at least.
Well, and actually, we do a lot of storytelling in the Capital District, which is a good thing, we think. And for those of you who are new, we're going to have some guests on in a bit that will share their own story and application of story in the work they're doing. And we'll hear some stories, and we'll also do some references, and one of the references is to our website, Story Circle at Proctor's, because .org, yes, and we have a guild of storytellers. There's probably 60 people in the Greater Capital District, and we do a lot of storytelling development work. By that I mean we listen to each other at meetings. We have open mics at Cafe Lena and in Schenectady, and we do some storytelling shows around the Capital District, and all that is on that website. So we'd like you to just know about that. And one of the real treasures there, I think, maybe that's small t, however, but they're treasures, is about 150 edited versions of guests that have been on this show telling stories. So if other television is boring, you can go to our website, right, Kate?
Right, if you can quote the repeats, if you've seen the repeats so often that you know the next line, really you should do something else.
Now, I have to do a little promotional work of my own right now.
Okay.
One of the nicest things that I've been involved with in storytelling is a very intimate gathering the first Tuesday of every month in Arthur's Market and Historic Cafe in the Stockade in Schenectady. And it's just a delightful place to gather and listen, and it's a spoken word open mic, so you can even read stories and poetry.
Or sing.
And we have just a wonderful time. And there isn't a cost, but you might want to buy a cup of coffee or eat dinner there. And I commend it to, because we just had one of the best programs, I think, because we had a celebration and chocolate cake, and we had Kate Dudding telling stories of her mother. We have a featured teller, and we shared stories of our mothers just before Mother's Day. And wasn't that a great night?
Yes, and Anne-Marie Mclaughlin was there, and she's been on our show. She told a wonderful story of when she was in Ireland, and Anne-Marie is a treat, and maybe she and I could do a program next year at the Irish American Heritage Museum.
I would think that was one of the other. That's one of the other programs that's been fun to do.
Yes. And Claire Nolan was there, and Joe was there. Was there another teller?
There was, but I can't. Well, I won't say I can't remember, but there was another good teller there, I'm sure.
And some audience members.
But anyway, it's easy listening, and it's an open mic, and later we'll talk a little bit about our open mic up in Saratoga, which is going to come up again and comes up every month. But I think the Irish American Heritage Museum, we've just launched a new partnership with this year, to have Shaughnessy nights, Shaughnessy evenings. And a Shaughnessy is the old Irish
Storyteller.
Traveled around bringing the news, before there was internet or newspapers. and newspapers were a problem, when they first came out, because not everybody could read. So the storyteller was even more important. And we've had some really neat programs. And we had a delightful presentation from Eileen Mack, where she becomes Jean Robert Foster, who is one of the most vivid American women writers and essayists and activists in the early part of the 1900s. And she came from Chestertown. And what is intriguing about her is that William Butler Yeats's father fell in love with her and followed her home. And not only did he follow her home,
How far did he get?
Well, he got all the way to Chestertown.
Oh.
He got all the way to Chestertown, and he's actually buried there because there wasn't enough money to ship him home when he passed away. So Jean Robert just buried him in the family plot. And he was a sculptor and an artist in his own right. And there's fascinating stories, and that's going to be happening one more time in May. So maybe some of you will catch it up in Saratoga, but it's one we ought to do sometime because it's a great go. And we did it at the Irish American Heritage Museum. Wow. What have you been doing in storytelling?
Well, I've started researching paintings by Van Gogh because there's going to be an exhibit at the Williamstown Museum, the Clark Art Institute, this summer, starting June 14th through September 14th approximately. Van Gogh and nature. 50 of his paintings, 50 works by him, mostly oil paintings, some drawings. And I like to find artists' own words. And he wrote 900 letters that are online.
900 letters?
Now, I don't, luckily they're indexed, and so you can put the name of the painting and find the letters where he's making reference to it. So I don't have to read all 900. First, always, I wanted to find some, and I found too many. But then when I found it was indexed, then I went, it's just right. So I'm busy reading.
And you'll be doing a program for the museum?
No, not for the museum, but I'll be doing an introductory lecture for both Friends of the Clifton Park Half Moon Public Library and for the Academy for Lifelong Learning up in Saratoga Springs.
Now, I'm going to, before we introduce our guests, I just have to get this in. I'm sorry. Can you just tell us a little bit about your guerrilla storytelling?
Oh, not the animal. It's the other kind of guerrilla.
The armed interventionist.
I have stories about Claude Monet, Winslow Homer, John Singer Sargent, a few, just some anecdotes about Degas. And when I'm in a museum where there are works of art by these people, I lurk by one of these works of art. And when someone has finished enjoying that art, it's just ready to move on, I go, excuse me, but I have a quick story about this painting. Would you like to hear it?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
I sit in wonder and awe.
Yeah.
Because I'm just bursting to share this information. And I've done it at the Clark, I've done it at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, I've done it at the Metropolitan in New York,
Really?
I've done it at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. At Smithsonian, I talk about Julia Child. I recite a poem that her husband wrote to her.
Wow.
So you've just gotten a new application of storytelling as methodology for social engagement and learning.
Right.
And we give it away to you for free on this radio or on this TV show.
Yes, please. I'd love other gorillas out there. And,
let us hear your story. I want to switch gears a little bit and not get overly serious, but we've got two people with us this morning that have developed an application of storytelling to take on one of the critical social justice issues of our time. And so when you think about the uses of story, both to entertain and to teach, These two women are doing storytelling to engage both the consciousness and the awareness of the critical issue of racism. And I want to introduce you now, and it's Barbara Spring and Sandy Powell. And you're here on behalf of Friends for Racial Justice.
Got it. Right.
And when I met you the first time or the second time, I was actually invited to a session that you hosted at the Albany Friends Meeting House on Madison Avenue.
Right.
And I was amazed at that. And I have known about Quakers, the Society of Friends, but I wasn't kind of aware of your social activity in the current sense about key issues. Could you just give us a little background of the context for your work? And then we'd like to hear a little bit more about that meeting.
Sure. The Friends for Racial Justice indeed is a committee out of the Friends meeting here in Albany, New York. And back when, a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we were studying our own history. Quakers have done a lot of good work with racial issues over the 300 some years.
Yeah,
but
like the abolitionist movement.
Right.
Like that, yes.
But we've done some very poor things too. We won't get into that right now, but we've done some poor things. So we're still working on it, and we're here today in our society, with this big issue of racism that is so prevalent. So in studying that, one day we invited an author to come, and we invited lots of friends from the community to come and hear what Quakers have done and not done over time. And that got us into forming. We had so much fun talking that day, sharing our stories and hearing things that we said, let's get together once a month and share our stories. So we started a fairly closed group so that we could develop the awareness of each other and understand each other's stories. And that went on for about a year. There were 10 of us that shared our life stories together. And Sandy Powell was one of those persons. So as we grew in growth as a group, we realized what a good message and strength that we had to share with the rest. So we are Quakers and then some helpers there that really do help us a lot understanding issues. So that, and the story issue, where did we first think of that, Sandy?
I think it was the workshop that Robin did. You might want to talk a little bit about that.
Right.
It's an amazing piece of work.
Right. There is a center for what white people can do about racism that comes out of the Quaker organization that and actually doing a third workshop this week at the meeting house. So that piece did give us the wisdom to think about, well, maybe we could just invite people to come and share their stories. And then we know about the interfaith story circle. And we caught up with Joe, and we thought, maybe this is something we can do.
Absolutely. Had a conversation with Joe, had a conversation with Audrey and they were very interested to see how a collaboration might come about. But I think we were interested in the same thing that you were. We don't come from the storytelling tradition in the sense of being, I call it, professional storytellers.
Platform,
Right. And
I've been called a lot of things, but professional is not one of them.
So the idea was, though, how could, since stories are so powerful and it's such a powerful way to convey not only information but feeling and connection. And in this workshop that she talked about, it was so powerful to hear people talk about the things that have been bothering them all their lives, but there was no place for them to have a conversation about it. And so that's what led us to think maybe there are more people that would welcome an opportunity to share their experiences, because our society doesn't talk about racism. It's a difficult
not
topic.
only the Friends, the rest of us.
Right, exactly.
That's true. And what impressed me from the beginning, when my wife and I showed up, when Jay and I showed up there, was the very rapid development of intimacy with people I didn't know.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it happens, there was a potluck.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, food
and
always helps.
food always helps.
All right.
And then, you know, people just began to talk, and that deepened this. I'll use the sense of intimacy because I think
Yes.
one of the reasons that we don't talk more about critical issues is that we're insulated and don't want to risk or risk that intimacy
Exactly.
and for. And perhaps it was just the nucleus of your 10 hearts who had been working together for so long that just kind of had that feeling bubble over. But it was really a great setting for the round of storytelling that you offered.
Well, we also knew that it was risky to do this.
Right.
And we were really, quite frankly, hoping somebody would come. We didn't know how many people to expect. We thought if 10 people show up, we'll be happy. And the place, I mean, people were hanging from the rafters. We were pulling furniture from all over the meeting house.
And then
to
other
accommodate
waves
people
would come
who
in
were
after
coming
you
in.
found that lost
Right.
furniture.
I know.
What are we going to do now?
Right.
And so I think we ended up with over 60 people
Yeah,
that
not
came.
big space.
Right.
Right.
And we had, I think, 14 tellers that night. And some were trained storytellers. They had previous experience. Others were people who just spoke from their heart about things that had been on their heart. And so it was quite a sharing. And that was really the environment. But we set it up to encourage that. We made sure that the speakers were center, the room was set in a circle to give that feeling of intimacy,
Yep.
the food.
Yeah, the Interfaith Story Circle.
Yes.
That's their model. That
Right.
they don't expect
Right.
polished stories. And when I've been there, I've sometimes held back because I don't want to. I do tell polished stories because I am a professional storyteller, but I don't want to inhibit somebody
Right.
from just saying, you know,
This is what happened.
yeah, this is what
Right.
happened to me, and they lose their composure and then they get back. They're telling from their broken hearts.
Right.
And
And I really think life stories are real important. There is a place for fantasy stories and other stories, but life stories is just a very important part of our development. I'm a gerontologist, and I see life stories as one of the important things we do at the end of life, and to bring closure to life. And if we can do stories all along the way, we're ever more primed to have a polished closing of our life, which is very important.
You talked about in the Irish tradition of telling stories, and in the African tradition, it's the same thing.
griot.
The griot, and
Griot,
then the village who was tasked with making sure that the history was transmitted to people. And I think with families being split the way they are, with people running here and there, working two jobs, getting the kids here and there, the opportunity to sit down together and to pass information along through stories is starting to disappear.
And it's become a luxury.
It is.
It really is.
And or the other social term might be almost an intervention, which is what you
or I mean, we also have
Oh, yeah. Right.
that.
Right.
You go to a restaurant, you see half of the table doing that. You're going, why are they there together?
And when you think of just a therapy session, you go to your therapist, and what do? You tell your story, and your therapist weeds out of there what the issues are to deal with it. And I think that's what our heart does when we tell our story. It sort of thinks, oh, that was really important from this perspective.
And so I think when people read a headline, I'm thinking now back to the racism piece of it. When people read a headline, they don't get the story. They get a snippet, they get a sound
And
bite.
they get the sensational part of it.
Right.
They don't understand what was in that person's heart at the moment when they were doing something that somebody perceived was wrong. But what was in the heart of that police officer at that moment when they took whatever action they took. And so, and then because we have 24-hour news, they have to have something to say, and so they will take something the size of an inch and blow it up the size of North Carolina and try to blow it into a story that doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's done a lot of damage in our society. News is good, but we're missing out on really what's behind the news.
There are about 2 or 3 things that I can segue us to, but
Okay.
I almost want to stop and ask you, when we were together in the meeting, you told a story,
I did, yes.
and it was powerful and brought aspects to the conversation that wouldn't have been there without it. And I don't know, we hadn't really talked about this, but if you could tell that story now, I'd like to talk about that story after you tell
sure.
it.
Okay.
And then after that, we'll take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the other branches that we've created, because we could go many different ways with this conversation.
Absolutely.
And so I've kind of taken the prerogative of one of the chairs, because I'd like to hear that story again.
Okay, all right.
Okay?
Well, I call this story Privilege, and it was inspired by the workshop that I participated in, because one of the conversations in that workshop was on white privilege, and people were feeling so apologetic about it. I didn't ask for it. I didn't even know I had it, and now here I am being accused of something that I don't even know what it is. And so as I started thinking about that in my own life, I started wondering, well, how else does this show up? Because if people don't even know they have it, then it must affect us in ways that we might not even know. So I started thinking back to some issues that had happened to me in my 20s, and I realized there's sort of another way to look at this privilege thing. And so it's not a polished story, but I'll tell it from the heart. So when I was in my 20s, I was having some female problems, shall we say. And so at that time, I had moved to Philadelphia, and after I got out of college, and didn't really know anybody. I didn't have any family there. And so I needed to find a doctor. So I asked some of my colleagues at work, who they would go to. And so several people, including a nurse, recommended this guy who was supposed to be the best. And so I went to him to see about these problems. So he looked at all of my symptoms, and he tried X, Y, and Z, and none of that seemed to work. And he had me taking all kinds of medications that didn't seem to help. And so finally he said, well, I think what we have to do is to do a myomectomy, which is an exploratory surgery, to try to figure out what the cause is. And so I, agreed to it, because I was in so much pain. I needed to do something to get to the bottom of it. And, once I had the surgery, he said, oh, well, the good news is we now know what the problem is. The bad news is the way to solve the problem is something that's not available to you. So the good news was that they diagnosed it or confirmed endometriosis. The bad news was, in order to get rid of it, you have to get pregnant. But because mine had been untreated for so long, the ovaries were pretty damaged, and they didn't think I could get pregnant.
Wow.
So fortunately, that turned out not to be true, because I have 2 sons. and a little
So
grandbaby.
take that, doctor.
Yeah, good. Take that, doctor. Right. But and so I didn't think anything of it. I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, and I had a cousin who was an MD. He was a OBGYN. All of our family doctors were black. I had never gone to a white doctor before, even though I lived in an integrated community. And I assumed that because of the oath that the doctor has to take and the training that they receive, that they're not really looking at color, they're looking at the disease and all of that. Well, then later I moved to Baltimore, and had to start to search all over again to find a doctor. But this time my husband had family in Baltimore, so they recommended the doctors they went to. So I went to the doctor they had gone to. And so when this doctor was doing my intake and looking at medical history, he said, why did you have this myomectomy? And I said, well, it was exploratory because, he said, stop right there. He said, you had something, they couldn't figure out what it was. You had presenting symptoms, and so therefore the doctor said the only way to figure it out is to do the surgery and confirm what he thought it might be. And I said, yeah, that's exactly right. He said, let me show you something. So he goes over to the counter or his bookcase, pulls off a book off the shelf and opens it up, and he says, now you told me that the doctor said it was endometriosis, right? And I said, right. So he said, read the first line of the description of endometriosis. And it said endometriosis is a disease that middle-class white women, professional white women have. And then he shut the book. And he said, I am so tired of doctors treating race and not disease. He said, every symptom you described is classic for this endometriosis. And so he said there was no reason to do that surgery. All they had to do was listen to the symptoms and match it. But because you didn't look like what the textbook said, you couldn't possibly have had endometriosis. And in fact, what they were treating you for was a venereal disease, because that was the thinking that if you're black, you probably are promiscuous, and therefore, you know, you probably have the other end of this thing. So
Wow.
it was discouraging, but that was back in the 70s. And I kind of thought we were past that until I was talking to a good friend of mine who is quite a bit older than me and has since passed. But she told me about growing up in Virginia and having surgery, major surgery with no anesthesia, because the belief was that black women had a high tolerance for pain and didn't need anesthesia. And then 6 months ago, another friend of mine tells me of a problem that she had where she suffered and went undiagnosed, was on the wrong medication, was almost paralyzed. And because the disease that she had is more common to older white women. And because she wasn't an older white woman, she couldn't possibly have had that disease. She finally got herself to a doctor who said, I think I know what the problem is. I know based on your symptoms, I think it's this, and I'm going to give you this medicine, and if that's what it is, this will be gone in 2 or 3 days. And it was.
Wow.
So I thought to myself, how can this still be going on? That doctors are still being trained this way. So it's not so much that the doctor may have had bad intention, but they're going on how they were trained.
The book said it.
The book said it, you know, and the books are still saying it.
Yeah, it's, I mean, like I said, when we described this gathering, there are 60 people,
Yeah.
and Sandy's telling this story, and in the room are people with similar stories who said, oh, by the way, this happened to me. And that's the other element. And none of that uncomfortable awareness would have been present without the precipitating event of your story. And if you had thought a little while ago, you know, what was going to be the topic of racism in the story, you wouldn't have called that one. But that's the nature of the gathering idea and the power of having those stories come up.
Right.
And it's just a very impressive thing you've begun to do, and it grows out of your faith background. It grows out of the social conscience that comes from that faith background. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's true.
Right. And we need to keep talking,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
telling the stories.
And I just, do you remember the reaction of the audience after you tell the story? Could you pick up on that, because you're into the story?
Right. I heard people going, and I saw some heads moving from side to side like in disbelief. And for me, the purpose of telling the story was to say that this racism is so insidious, and it's in so many small areas that we can't, it's not just a headline, it's not the race card, it's every single thing, every single day. And
Every single thing, every single day.
and so that was the reason I said, well, it's something that people live, but people wouldn't necessarily know it by just looking
Right.
at it. Right.
Well, you didn't know it initially.
Right, I didn't. I really didn't. I really didn't.
You know, I'm going to suggest we take a deep breath.
Okay.
And Kate and I are going to do a little bit of promo work, and then we're going to come back here and talk about one or two things.
Okay.
One, the buildup of all this history and how that affects the current conversation or story, because I think that's one issue. And then, based on that, is it possible to kind of use the story to begin to shave that elephant in the room, or how you do that? Because I think for you, you've got a great start, and we want to maybe talk over how we might go on.
Okay.
Kate, my good friend and fellow storyteller, fellow professional storyteller. We've got a few things happening.
Yes, yes. Somehow storytelling seems to follow the Native American tradition that it mostly happens in the cold time. That I think in the Abenaki tradition,
That's right.
that they only tell between the first frost and the last frost because they don't want the growing plants to stop and listen too. And maybe they don't want the workers in the fields to stop and listen too. But so we have fewer events over the summer because people are out and about. But we do, starting June 2nd, I got the date wrong, so you have some flyers that say June 3rd. But first Tuesday there'll be stories of love and marriage at Arthur's in the Stockade in Schenectady.
And that comes right out of a very good leading question. When I meet people and establish a relationship, I said, well, how did you meet your lover? How did you meet your wife? And it's surprising what a good question that is for people just opening their heart a little bit, because it's always a good story, and it takes you all sorts of places. So if you've got one of those, come on over.
I think I do.
You do?
I certainly have a humdinger of our first date.
Oh, wow. There we go.
And then on June 10th, it's the open mic in Saratoga Springs takes a break in July and August. So on Wednesday, June 10th, there'll be an open mic at Woodlawn Commons. It's the Harkness building of the Wesley community on Clement Street. It's behind Hospice. You can go to our website and click on open mics and find more
And get directions.
More detailed directions. But it's free when we're at the Wesley Woodlawn Commons, and they give us cookies and punch afterward.
That's right.
And we get to tell to the people who live there. So we get a nice audience, but non-residents are quite welcome also. And then our next Story Circle meeting will be on Wednesday, June 17th. Oh yes, I've got those dates right. At least it's the right interval, 7 days between 2 Wednesdays. At the Honest Way Food Co-op, and at 6:15 to 7, I'll be talking about an article that I read in the latest Storytelling magazine, a publication of the National Storytelling Network, on how to create unforgettable stories. So one author's ideas on how to do that.
And what's really nice about meeting at the co-op is you can graze beforehand, because the community room we use is right off their whole food deli section, and you can just go graze and see what's on the specials, and they'll make stuff up for you, and then you can come and have the round table, and then you can go back and get a cup of coffee and come back in and have your storytelling things going on, and it's just a
and
great
then when
place
it's
to be.
over, then you can do your shopping.
That's
and
true.
go home. So it's an evening that solves many needs.
What's the date of that again?
June 17th.
Okay.
Okay, you can actually have that. I'm
thank
done
you.
with that sheet now.
Thank you.
So that's all I have. Do you have
And,
anything?
you know, we have a calendar item also.
Oh, do we?
Oh,
Yes, we
Yes.
do.
oh,
So
good.
mark your calendar for June 26th
Okay.
at Albany Friends Meeting House. And we'll start with potluck at 6 again.
Wow.
And 6:30 we'll start working towards stories. And this time we sort of taking off from Sandy stories. We want to focus on institutional stories. You know, the doctor's office, the schools. There's lots of institutions. The library, lots of institutions. Where have you experienced racism in institutions, from institutions, with institutions, or whatever? Yeah, right.
Wow.
So, again, we're going to do it and see
Cool.
what we do.
So that was June 26th.
It's a Friday night.
Friday, okay. 6 o'clock for the potluck,
Right.
6:30 for the stories.
Right.
Racism in institutions.
Right.
Yes.
You're most welcome. That's 727 Madison.
7:26.
Right down near the Washington Park.
Right at the top of the park.
right
Top of the park.
at The top of the park.
Yeah. And
And we might say we thought we would. People come straight from work sometimes, and so we wanted just a little modest something for them to have to eat. Well, and in the Black community, food is important, and in the Quaker community, food is important. So our modest little potluck turned into a feast.
Yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
And people were very generous as far as putting in the pot too.
Yeah, they
It was really
were.
nice.
I find that if each person brings more than they could eat, even though you wouldn't want to eat 26 meatballs or whatever,
Right, exactly.
but if everybody brings more than they can eat, you will have more than enough.
Oh yeah.
That's true, and it works.
Yes.
It works.
It certainly worked for me that first time I made friends.
So, and that's, okay, so I'll make a slide for that. And the
Okay,
people have been
thank you.
seeing that. And I'll add that to our slide, and we send out an email to our people
Okay.
at the
Terrific.
beginning of each month, plus email. Because I know a lot of our listeners might be, and that's both our guild members and our 500-600 listeners that have come to our storytelling events over the years.
Fabulous.
So, okay, and then we just mention once again that we have stories mostly from this show that are on our website, storycircle@proctors.org. Click on the button YouTube, and I've categorized them by humorous, personal, traditional, historical, maybe there's another category, but that gets you to our actual YouTube channel. And you can, we've had over 36,000 people watch, stories watched over the 4 years. Yeah, something like that.
Great.
So,
Well,
That's
so
very good.
so you can kind of, like when things are dull and you have time, want to listen to a story.
or if you've heard this fabulous show and you've gone to the website yourself and you tell your friends about storytelling for adults and they go, huh? You can point them to those. You can be our ambassadors, and we thank you in advance for that.
Well, let's go back and revisit the issue of kind of our what I will refer to as the conditioned response. You know, I respond to you because you're Black,
Right.
in a way that's different because you're white. And in the news, certainly the police have been responding with that, I'll call it bias. Although I think what we're dealing with is this phenomenal residual. I mean, the story most recently that we were talking about beforehand about 4 parole officers, Black policemen, in a different community were hassled by the police, including being roughed up, and they had their ID on, they had their vests on, and they told them who they were, and it didn't seem to, dissuade
No respect.
the local police. And those are, you can pick those right out of the paper almost every day.
Absolutely.
And we've had sensitivity training, we've done things. So can we talk a little bit about what your group could begin to do, because you're doing great work, but that's one of the cultural challenges,
Sure, it is.
I think. And one of the things I thought was important about the first gathering is that because of some of the kids that are involved with Children at the Well,
Right.
young people showed up, college students showed up, and they had their own perspective, because one of those kids told a story.
Absolutely. Told a story.
And put it right into the school system.
Absolutely.
So
Which is an institution.
which is an
One of those
institution.
institutions, right, right.
So, and within your own within your own circle.
Well, we struggle with that within our circle, I mean, quite frankly, because it's a huge issue. And it is like the elephant in the room. Where do you start? What piece of it do you decide to attack? And because it's so complex and things are so connected, you could spend a lot of time in one small area and affect very little change. And so part of, I think, the reason that we came to stories is because of the heart that's connected to it, and both of our, I mean, Barbara's Quaker, and I'm out of a non-denominational tradition, and so, but we both have strong faith backgrounds, and so the heart is connected to that. Community service, making life better for people is connected to that. There are public policy issues that are connected to this, and so I think, from speaking for myself, I'm hoping that the 60-some people that came all come from various backgrounds and different areas of influence. If they could just take something back to the area, to the territory that's been assigned to them, shall we say, to start to have a new awareness or a new awakening about some of these things, it would be useful. I mean, people have asked us, are you going to write a book? Are you going to make a movie? Are you setting up a blog? And we don't know the answer to that yet.
Not yet. But we're open to ideas.
Yeah, because the stories are so powerful.
They are.
I remember you mentioned diversity training, so that was the 90s, something like that. And there was, I worked at GE's Research Center, and one of the leaders of my diversity training group was an African-American glassblower.
Ooh.
And he also participates in the Empire Games. So he's a very athletic-looking fellow. He has a very dark skin. Okay, and he told a story that I've never forgotten, and that's 90s. You know, we're talking 20 years.
Right.
And he said, I was on vacation in New Hampshire, and on the seacoast, and I went into a shop. And as I was going in, a white woman came out, and she said, I'll be right back to help you. I just have to run a quick errand. And he said, I went in there. I realized that she was the shopkeeper, the only person in the store. And she left me alone there. In Schenectady, I am followed when I go into a store.
It's a
And that just raised goosebumps on my arms, and it still does. That why Larry is treated that way, just you know, that literally the color of his skin. And I've never had anybody follow me in a store.
It's a very common happening.
Right.
Yeah. Very common.
So every time you hear one of these stories, I go, that's. You probably even dread going shopping, you know, or there's, or you know, or well, I remember when it was common that women, that especially construction workers, would whistle and say lewd comments at women, and I would cross the street. I would try to avoid that. So it you know, that's just a tiny experience that happened, you know, 2-3 times a year or something. But I remember the dread of, okay, could be coming again.
Get ready for it.
Right, get ready for it. But this is every store. This is almost every day. Just that little segment of it. So it's just a window into someone's life.
And there are so many, especially when we think about institutions, there are so many doors that get closed because of that, and or so much abuse that happens. You know, direct abuse. It's one thing to be followed, but it's another thing to be thrown in jail. And that's one of our biggest problems today. It's now finally getting a little attention. The mass incarceration, and the war on drugs. You know, we don't want people to make bad choices with drugs, but on the other hand, we have so militarized that whole thing when it's a medical issue. It's a societal issue that needs to be dealt with. So that takes it to a whole nother broad thing. And certainly some of those stories about the drug culture and the impact of racism there is huge.
StoryCorps. Have you heard
Oh,
of
sure.
StoryCorps?
Oh, yeah.
Going around talking about, usually they have focused topics like civil rights, you know, what did you do during the civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. StoryCorps, if they could be convinced to collect stories on racism today in everyday lives.
Right.
That would put a big spotlight on this.
I mean, I can't tell you the number of people who have said to me, well, Obama's the president, so that's all finished. Why are you guys still talking
Why are those
about
guys and why are those white
Yeah.
guys from the South in Congress so mad at Obama?
Right.
But it's more like, well, racism is finished, so let's move on. Stop talking about it. It's not an issue anymore. And so, but that shows, I mean, maybe they're looking at one element, but there's so many other aspects that they're not seeing.
Yes.
And so that, I think, is part of the conversation that needs to happen. Even being able to sit and talk about it in a way that people don't have to get upset or defensive, but to actually hear from each other.
The thought I just had, two thoughts. One is that the product you're selling or you're offering is really the engagement.
Totally.
It's the conversation. And to the extent that the conversation then leads places, one of the focuses might be is how do we get this engagement of having groups start this conversation in other
Right.
places. And the follow-up question is if we offered a little tutorial, would people show up? And I think that they would. And I actually heard when I promoted the flyers and things in Schenectady, well, would they come to Schenectady because they have to go all the way to Albany? You know, they go to Albany to work every day, and
Right.
they'd have to go all the way to Albany. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the focuses. And you know what? I had another focus, and I'll be damned if I
It just drifted off.
It's gone. It's out of focus.
It'll come back, Joe.
But there's a woman in the community, the Albany community, Barbara Smith, who's done a lot of work in this area. She's written a book and has been nationally recognized for the work that she's done in this area. And so there's NCBI, I think you may have mentioned their training. So I think there might be places where we can connect to things that are already happening, to see, just like connecting to you guys,
Right.
to make sure that we're not off in a corner just doing something without recognizing
Right.
that there's already a path here
Right.
that people have already paved, and all we have to do is sort of
Join.
get on it and see how we can work together to make this thing go forward.
Right. That's Sue O'Halloran in Chicago.
Yes.
I'll have to
Well, there's-
connect you people because
Yeah.
she's been doing this for over 10 years.
Yeah. Oh,
good.
Stories
Good,
of
good.
justice, social justice.
Justice, yes.
One of-
But she had a trio performance of she's Irish background, an African American, I think a Jewish fellow.
Okay.
So
There's
and she lived on the edge of a black neighborhood in Chicago, and so she walked down the same street and go, the garbage isn't being collected here; it's being collected here.
Exactly.
Right.
She grew up with that. So okay.
the other connection, and I think you've made it or know her, but Marcia Mortimer,
Yes.
who's over in the Duryea AME Zion Church, is quite active in several venues
Yes.
that are helpful. And it's intriguing to me that the AME conference of the denomination actually owned the Harriet Tubman house
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
really?
in Auburn. That
Okay.
they own it. It's in the National Park Service's
Okay.
keeping, but it's their care. So they have a foundation that supports it. They have kids that go and serve as docents during the summertime and stuff. And I know that because we have an exchange with Duryea from our church in Schenectady.
Okay.
And we always go and sing for their fundraiser, and then we get to have the choir from Duryea come and sing in our church.
Oh, nice.
So it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
But we've gotten very involved in that whole process. And this is the other reality is, and I say this to people who take exception to gay rights as well. If I ask people about, do you know any gay people, they generally their bias is that they're anti-gay, but they don't know anybody that's gay, that's outwardly gay. And I'm fortunate that I have friends who are black, but not everybody who's white does.
Right,
And
right.
therein lies one of
Makes
the
a
other
lot of
realities,
difference.
because. And the other thing that I think,
And it's also true in the black community, too.
it's true.
Oh, I'll bet.
You know,
I'll bet.
It goes both ways.
Oh,
Yeah.
I understand that too.
I mean, there was a girl in Children at the Well who said she had never met anyone who wasn't Catholic. It was like, oh my goodness!
Yeah.
Right.
I grew up
Right.
Catholic, but it was in a minority white religion in the town in Connecticut where I grew up.
Certainly on March 6th, when we had our gathering that night, we had nice variety, wonderful variety.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was very important. I wanted to mention that just this past Saturday at the Tulip Festival, the Grannies for Peace had their annual vigil, and they focused on racism. And it was the most effective vigil they have ever had. They're just thrilled with it. And they said they were so delighted with the adoration, the connection they had with persons of color that came by. You know, lots of hugs and, you know, shaking hands and connecting points. So I think it's a real way to open the conversation, really provides some connections.
Well, it definitely does.
Some real connections.
Grannies for Peace.
Right.
You have to go Google that one too.
You're right.
Sounds like there's a story there.
Right. Lots of
Because
history.
just well,
They used to wear tie-dye. Just comes to mind. That's what I did.
now within the greater Society of Friends,
Right.
is this topic and method ongoing? I mean, do you have?
Well, I don't know about the stories, but we have a lot of good things going. We're working hard at it,
for you.
very hard at it. From the national organizations, the Friends General Conference has a track of learning, some materials and stuff that were very important. And like this workshop that's being done Saturday at the Meeting House, that's a Friends group, sort of a adjunct kind of thing. And many of us have done letters of apology within the last 5 or 6 years, you know, where we've really reflected on what our role has been in history. And our sadness for the things we did or did not do that we should have done, you know. And I found that very important, and that provides us then a door opener to say, okay, so the past was the past, but let's go forward and make sure we're touching things now.
One of the things that impressed me about the way that the Friends have approached this whole issue is they asked themselves the question, how is it that over the centuries we've done all of this work? We are known in the world for peace. We're known in the world for our advocacy, our involvement in the abolitionist movement. How is it that we have been so active in all of this, but it's not reflecting in our membership? If we look at who comes
a white group.
How is it that that's not making the translation?
Right.
The fact that they asked that question, I thought, how many organizations could just look at themselves and say, gee, we have all these open policies, we subscribe to all of this fairness, but it's not showing up. It's not showing up in our members. It's not showing up in our workforce. Not showing up in our neighborhood. Something is stopping it from moving forward. What is it? And they have really taken the challenge to look at that to say, let's see if we can get our hands on this.
You know, you're right. We have the same conversation in the Reformed Church.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. And with the gay rights issue as well, and we've gone through that dialogue and become open and welcoming. And although, you know, if you stay at it, we have now 3 Black African-American families in the congregation.
Lucky.
It's just happened in the last year. And part of that came, we started, when our new minister arrived 6 years ago, he started a Jazz Vesper program.
There you go.
And that attracts, at 5 o'clock every Sunday, that attracts a different mix of people. And not only are they people of color, but they're the Daughters of Sarah and the Teresian House share a bus.
How neat.
And these people come off who are living in their assisted living facility.
Sure.
They go to Jazz Vespers, and then they go pub crawling with a designated driver in downtown Schenectady. I mean, I didn't believe it.
Did you start up that part of
I
the
didn't
thing?
start.
Yeah.
They thought that up all on their
Come on,
own.
Joe.
And it's taken a while, but that's been part of the issue, so it does take time,
Yeah.
Right.
and you do wonder, and we're white and upper middle class,
Right.
God forbid, but
Right.
you got to be open about it, and you got to be welcoming, and I think for any of us, being really welcoming takes work.
The church that I go to is predominantly black, although it's non-denominational and interracial. And so sometimes I think about the white families that are in our church, because we have a lot of white families that are in our church. Like, what is it that allows them to feel welcome and to keep coming? And now we've got Spanish-speaking people that are in the congregation. We have people from other countries, from Africa and French-speaking Haiti, and they come to hear the sermon. But many times, particularly the Spanish-speaking people, may not even speak English well enough
Right.
to understand all the words that are being said. And so now it's opening up new opportunities for ministries in our church to be able to say, how do we keep people engaged? We need to learn some Spanish so that when they come in the door, we can say, something that means something, not just hola.
Just the one word.
No, yes, exactly right.
Although hola works, I mean, it's better than saying huh.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Well, I think you came up with a good thing at your church, Joe, doing the jazz. One of the problems, I have to say, with Friends meeting is it's a silent service. And so we don't have the choirs singing or the good preaching, but the messages then come from the individuals. We're all supposed to be ministers. And that's a tough assignment, And so we sit for an hour and wait for the Spirit to move us to talk. But in a very defined spiritual message to come forward. And then, we love it. We like the meditation part of it and the quietness and the ability to reflect and let the Spirit move us in our particular situation. But it's unique.
Well,
Yeah.
that one of the other things we could have a fairly active discussion on is the way the Spirit moves in the world.
Yes.
Yes.
And
Those would be great
But we only
stories.
have 2 minutes left.
well, then we probably can't have that
Get very
discussion.
far into that right now.
Well, let's just pause and reflect. In addition to saying thank you for bringing your program to our viewing public
And our area.
and our area,
Thank you.
we really appreciate the time. We'd be happy to help you in any way going forward. And then, do you have a reference? Could people find you if they go to the Albany Friends Meeting website? Can they get a hold of you?
Oh, good question.
No.
But we have our
We have an email address.
Email, oh.
Yes, which is, it's a long one. Stories and the number 4, Rachel Healing @gmail.com.
Stories
For-
number
Stories
4.
for
Racial
racial
healing.
healing @gmail.org.
.com.
No, gmail.com.
Yeah.
Okay, that'll be on a slide.
So-
And it'll be on the, yes, it'll be
Okay.
both of the,
Right.
our opening and closing slides.
Oh, thank you.
So if you want to know more, you can email.
Yes.
And come
Right.
on
And-
Friday, February 26th at 6 o'clock.
June.
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 February. Where did February
Yeah.
come from?
I don't want to say anything, but the June 26th starts a year-long observance of Joe Doolittle's 70th birthday. Birthday is
goodness.
actually on the 27th.
Oh, so
And-
so June 26th will be the last time you'll be in your 60s.
What a wise guy you are.
Well, that means
Yeah.
we'll really have to beep up the potluck.
Look, I want
Cake.
I'll find a cake.
Cake, we'll have cake.
Oh,
Chocolate cake.
Right.
Well, we had chocolate cake at Arthur's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, we
it's
did.
yummy.
I picked up on that. You
Yes.
seem to like
I
it.
said
That's how we can get connections.
There you go.
chocolate cake.
Exactly.
There we go.
That'll do it.
Okay, and we have to say thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you
and
for having us.
We hope you'll come back again.
Keep your stories rolling.
Rolling.
It goes all my life, so life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round,